Ever-loving God, we give you thanks and praise for the life of our Holy Mother, Saint Teresa, and for all those who seek to give artistic expression, new insight, and a deeper understanding to her many mystical experiences. May we be inspired by her experience, her perseverance, her determination, and her immense love of you. Pierce our lives with the fire of your love and claim us as your own. Open our minds, transform our hearts, consume us in your love. Strengthen our faith and inflame our desire, so that, like Teresa, we may never be content with anything less than you. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Thank you, Celia. The Carmelite Lecture is one of the means that we have of sharing our Carmelite charism, this very rich 800-year-old tradition of spirituality, with a larger audience, and inviting people to participate more deeply in the heritage, the contemplative heritage in particular, of Carmel. That today is an age in which people often are not looking for religion, but are looking for spirituality. They're on spiritual quests. And the Carmelite tradition is very rich in its heritage of people like St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, Blessed Elizabeth of the Trinity, and so many others. So we're really delighted to have this opportunity to have this lecture today. And I've invited a good friend of mine, Dr. Christopher Wilson, to give the lecture. And I've known Christopher for almost 20 years now, as he was a frequent user of our Carmelite Library in Washington. We have a phenomenal collection of Carmelite materials. Actually, second only to our collection in Rome is our collection in Washington, D.C. of books on Carmelite, books and other materials on Carmelite spirituality. And Christopher often came there to do research, as he's written extensively, researched extensively on the subject of the art of St. Teresa, both her portrayal in art and the art with which she would have been familiar with in 16th century Spain. So I was delighted to invite Christopher, so let me read the formal introduction that I've been given. So we're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Christopher Wilson, a specialist in Carmelite art of early modern Europe and Latin America. He has edited and co-authored The Heirs of St. Teresa of Avila, which was jointly published by ICS and the Carmelite Institute. And he has contributed to numerous exhibition catalogs published by St. Joseph's University Press. In addition, Dr. Wilson has contributed to the volumes Approaching to Teaching the Spanish Mystics and Women in Art in Early Modern Europe and Latin America. Dr. Wilson has published articles on Carmelite art in journals that include Carmelis, Archive for Reformation History, and Tradición Revista. He has lectured at the National Gallery of Art, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, the United States Department of State, and the embassies in Mexico and Peru. Dr. Wilson has received his doctorate in art history from George Washington University, and he now teaches at the Holton Arms School in Bethesda, Maryland. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Christopher Wilson.
Thank you so much, Father Patrick, for all the years that you and the friars at White Friars Hall have supported my Carmelite studies, and also many thanks to the Discal's friars for jointly publishing that book with the Institute for Militano. And also a big thank you to Joan and Kenita for all that you've done to make this event happen. Some works of art exert such a hold on viewers' attention that they become stand-ins for the historical figures that they represent. Gilbert Stuart's solemn portraits have indelibly shaped how we picture George Washington. And Holbein's depiction of a weighty and imposing Henry VIII define our mental picture of them, despite the recent television series The Tudors' attempt to make him into a trim monarch whose youthful handsomeness is more in accordance with 21st century taste. Warhol's icon-like portrayals of Marilyn Monroe have become inextricable from Marilyn. The same association between image and historical memory has affected Teresa. Mention her name in casual conversation, and the topic often turns to Bernini's famous 17th century statue in the Coronary Chapel of Rome's Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria. Reproduced in nearly every survey of Western art text, where it's celebrated as a climactic portrayal of the experience of divine love, and frequently used as a cover illustration for modern editions of Teresa's own writings. Bernini's portrayal has become the means through which many modern audiences learn about Teresa. But lopsided perceptions of the statue, I would argue, have led to considerable distortion of how she is remembered. I teach at a school for girls, Fulton Arms School, Bethesda, and think about how this piece must look to young men's eyes, given its coverage in today's media. My efforts to hold up Teresa as a feminist role model who accomplished what should have been impossible in the patriarchal culture of Counter-Reformation Spain are undermined by much of what the students read and see. The standard art history survey books reflect contemporary perceptions of the statue. They say little about Teresa, sometimes quoting from her description of her vision of the piercing of her heart, and then focused on the carved figure's, quote, swooning, sensuous body, to take a passage from Marilyn Stockstead's widely used textbook. Because Bernini's statue, more than any other depiction of the saint, heightens the physical aspects of her vision, sexuality governs analysis of the piece. The most commonly used art history survey books emphasize the intersection of the divine and erotic, such as Gardner's Art Through the Ages. Quote, Bernini depicted the saint in ecstasy, unmistakably a mingling of spiritual and physical passion. Jansen's book connects it with the 16th century painting of the nude nymphs, Seduction. Quote, Bernini has made Teresa's visionary experience as sensuously real as Correggio's Jupiter and Iron. None of these texts offers a more expansive understanding about how, within the mystical tradition, the imagery of human love has often been appropriated to express divine love. Nor do they comment on the associations that the image would have evoked among early modern viewers, such as Teresa's accomplishments as a monastic reformer and, according to her early biographers, her identity as a martyr annihilated by divine love. Thus, a more nuanced understanding of the piece gets lost in language that is insinuating or that verges on the pornographic, as in Simon Seamus' 2007 Power of Art television series on PBS. Quote, what Bernini managed to make tangible is something that we all, if we're honest, know we hunger for. No wonder when art historians look at this, they tie themselves in knots to avoid saying the obvious, that we're looking at the most intense, convulsive drama of the body that any of us experience between birth and death. And to take a passage from Dan Brown's novel, Angels and Demons, which, though fictional, reflects popular assessment. Quote, the sculpture, as anyone who had seen it could attest, was anything but scientific. Pornographic, maybe, but certainly not scientific. Though brilliantly rendered, the statue depicted St. Teresa on her back in the throes of a toe-curling orgasm. Teresa is thus locked in a narrative that focuses on the degree to which sexuality is present in the statue. Receiving such cues from their textbooks and popular culture, students might understandably see it as one more variant in a long tradition of images of recumbent women who succumb to seduction, chronologically bookended in the 16th century by Titian's Danae, in which the reclining woman is seduced by Jupiter in the form of a shower of golden coins, and in the 18th century by Fuseli's Nightmare, in which a woman is overwhelmed by an incubus who preys on her passive body. A classroom anecdote recounted by a colleague of mine who teaches at University of Kansas sums up the problem. When she brought up Teresa in one of her classes, a student raised her hand and said, oh, is she the nun who had the orgasm? To be fair, I must acknowledge that this line of thinking actually goes back to the 17th century. Bernini was accused, even during his own era, of having lowered Teresa to a lewd physical plane. One of his contemporaries criticized him for having, quote, pulled Teresa to the ground and made this pure virgin into a Venus, not only prostrate, but prostituted. This interpretation, I believe, has become accelerated in our own time. My comments today, then, are intended to serve as a corrective to audience reaction that has extended from the 17th to the 21st centuries. They offer ways that we can expand the discourse around the statue and therefore around Teresa herself. Students should understand that Bernini's statue is potentially an expression of female agency. To find this potential, we can look at how 4 viewers unlock the statue's implications: an 18th century engraver, a 19th century sculptor, and 2 20th century writers. More broadly, my comments also offer a window into artistic imagination. Artists and writers are better observers than most of us. One place they see is into the past. They often look back to their predecessors' artistic achievements and appropriate, rearrange, and extol, and sometimes subvert what they find there. They find meaning in certain pieces, store these in their bank of images, sometimes obsess over them, and then transmute them into their own arrangement of artistic form. Let me give you one example of what I'm talking about. Last spring, there was a small exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art of recent paintings and prints by Jasper Johns entitled Regrets. The works were all related products of his fascination with a photograph of the British painter Lucian Freud. Johns became fixated not just on the figure of Freud, but also on the physical properties of the damaged photograph itself, with its creases, tears, and folds. He, in his abstract paintings, enlarged, rotated, and multiplied the figure of Freud and the irregularities of the paper photograph in a series of paintings and prints. The project embodies a statement by Johns. He said, take an object, do something to it, do something else to it, repeat. The artists and authors expressed here, take an object, Bernini's statue, and cogitate upon it, transform it, and find usefulness for it in new context. My third aim today, and most important for all of us here who are engaged with Carmelite ideology, is to propose that each of these artist creations can act as a lens through which we look back, not only to Bernini's statue, but to Teresa herself. Since the statue has become synonymous with Teresa, then how we look at it can also inform how we look back to the saint, make sense of her life, and find those elements that most have meaning for us. As we look at these images, I hope you will consider what Teresa's most famous mystical experience means to you. Can any of these artists and writers help shape your own mental picture of this pivotal episode in her life and its implications for you as Teresa Eustace? First, let's start with Teresa's account of her vision of the piercing of her heart in chapter 39 of her spiritual autobiography, The Book of Her Life. It occurred while she was still a nun at the convent of the Incarnation in Avila, before her founding of her first convent in 1562. Quote, the Lord wanted me, while in this state, to see sometimes the following vision. I saw close to me toward my left side an angel in bodily form. The angel was not large, but he was very beautiful, and his face was so aflame that he seemed to me to be one of those very sublime angels that appear to be all on fire. I saw in his hands was a large golden dart, and at the end of the iron tip there appeared to be a little fire. It seemed to me this angel plunged the dart several times into my heart, and that it reached deep within me. When he drew it out, I thought he was carrying off with him the deepest part of me, and he left me all on fire with great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and the sweetness this greatest pain caused me was so superabundant that there was no desire capable of taking it away. Teresa's vision, known as the Transverberation, was officially highlighted by the Church on the day of her canonization in 1622, when a banner depicting this most famous of her mystical experiences adorned the interior of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The subject captured the attention of Baroque artists such as Peter Paul Rubens, who around the year 1614 painted a transverberation of the Church of the Discalced Carmelites in Brussels, and numerous engravers such as Adrian Collard and Cornelis Halle, who included it in their print series of Teresa's life published in Antwerp in 1613. Bernini must have looked back to these early paintings, Teresa's own written account, and widely circulated biographies of the saint, such as those by Francisco de Ribera and Diego de Yepes, first editions of which are when determining the composition of the statue. It is the centerpiece of this funerary chapel designed for the Venetian Cardinal Federico Cornaro at the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria. Bernini intended for the entire room to be a total work of art, from the walls that be covered in multicolored marble panels, crowned by a projecting cornice, to inlaid designs in the floor. These elements are the surrounding theatrical set for the drama that unfolds directly over the altar. Teresa and Angel, though carved from a heavy block of marble, seem to rise upward on a cloud toward a view into heaven that is painted on the wall, which you see. Oops, here. As if Teresa is in the midst of one of her levitations. Bernini achieved this floating effect by fastening the piece to the back wall with hidden metal bars. Illumination comes from a window concealed behind the pediment, you see here, and that's not visible to viewers standing in front of the statue. So that they seem to be bathed in the same divine light that is painted on the vault above them. Flanking the altar are figures of members of the Cornaro family, who you see here, reading from books, presumably Teresa's autobiography or early accounts of her life. And they look as if they're seated in loge boxes in a theater and conversing excitedly about this wondrous event that they're seeing happen at the altar. The presence of these lifelike audience members energizes the space between the altar and the rest of the chapel, so that we as viewers are both witnesses and participants in the drama that unfolds around the stage. The Baroque engraver. A set of 18th century prints by the prolific Flemish engraver Arnold van Westerhout attests to the continued impact of Bernini's statue a century after its completion. Published in Rome in 1716 under the title Illustrated Life of the Seraphic Virgin, St. Teresa of Jesus, this series of 67 engravings is the most comprehensive treatment of the saint's life to have been produced in any artistic medium. The friars of the Order of Carmel and Discalced Carmelites jointly commissioned the engravings and dedicated them to Ippolita Ludovisi, Princess of Piombino and grandniece of Pope Gregory XV, who had canonized Teresa in 1622. The images that I'm showing you are from the set, the Carmelite Collection of Blackfriars Hall, and thank you to Father Patrick Meehan for calling them to my attention several years ago and for letting me spend many days with them in the library. This is the dedication page. The series depicts the saint's childhood, entry into Carmel, mystical experiences, work as author and founder of convents, death, and posthumous apparitions. Compared with earlier engravings of Teresa's life, their artistic quality is exceptionally high. Throughout the series, Van Westerhout demonstrates his skills at pictorial invention by deftly choreographing interactions of Teresa with saints, angels, demons, and placing this cast of characters in complex interior spaces and expansive outdoor settings. Van Westerhout portrays the transverberation in two sequential images, numbers 18 and 19 of the series. The first is based on Bernini's statue. Living in Rome, the artist no doubt spent time in the Cornaro Chapel and sketched the statue in preparation for engraving his metal plate. He pays homage to Bernini by posing his figures nearly identical to those in the original statue, and inspired by the illusion of levitation that Bernini had created, places the angel and saint on a cloudy mass. The inscription, all these prints have inscriptions in Latin at the bottom, reads, St. Teresa was so afire with love for God that she merited to have an angel transfix her breast with a fiery spear. The engraving that immediately follows is, to my knowledge, an unprecedented one. It shows the aftermath of the piercing. Teresa has fallen from the cloud back to earth, where her limp body is supported by two angels on what appears to be a patio. The angel who wounded her here still hovers in the cloud setting, holding an arrow on which Teresa's heart is impaled. And it's hard to see, but there's her heart. The inscription reads, the Virgin Teresa, wanting to be dissolved and to be with Christ, knows consoling ecstasy as a seraphic spirit draws out her heart. By joining this novel image to the previous one of the Transverberation, Van Westervelt goes beyond Bernini and demonstrates his own powers of invention by creating a sequential unfolding of events. The angel plunges the arrow into her heart and then draws it out. It is as we, the viewers, are watching the story progress in a staged performance, with one moment flowing into the next. Like all the artists I'm discussing today, Van Westervelt would not have been content to be regarded as a mere copyist, a label that might have stuck had he only created the single scene of transverberation that depends so heavily on its 17th century prototype. What is important here is not just the echo and amplification of Bernini's statue and Van Westervelt's engravings, but also the deliberate placement of these two scenes within the larger narrative of the entire series. The next image, number 20, is pivotal. It shows Teresa levitating again in the company of Christ, who points toward the splendors of heaven, beneath which is a diminutive group of people. See these tiny figures. The inscription says, "The Holy Virgin Teresa, wrapped in spirit to heaven, hears Jesus say to her, 'See, daughters, what great blessings for themselves these sinners lose.'" By placing this scene immediately after the Transverberation, Van Westervelt departs from the chronological sequence of the saint's autobiography. Teresa does not recount this particular vision near her relation of the piercing of her heart, but places it instead close to the end of the book in chapter 38, after she has already told the lengthy story of the founding of her first convent. The artist has inserted the scene in this spot within the engraved series in order to make a crucial point, that Teresa's mystical experiences fueled her work as a monastic reformer, with a zeal for saving souls. Central to her project of founding 17 convents of nuns was an overriding desire to rescue the groups of two groups who, in her view, were headed toward damnation: the Protestants in Europe and the unconverted Indians in the New World. Through unceasing prayer and rigorous observance of the primitive or unmitigated Carmelite rules, she asserted, her nuns could assist the church and counteract further loss of souls. Since the communities of women would remain occupied in prayer for priests and defenders of the faith, those who were on the front lines of the church's militant offensive, quote, "We shall be fighting for God even though we are very cloistered." She insisted that within each of her new communities, nuns should undertake prayerful supplications and austerities on behalf of the church's efforts to save souls, such as the sinners in Van Westervelt's print who are deprived of heavenly blessing. Through his arrangement of images, Van Westervelt conveys that Teresa's conversations with Christ and the spiritual delights that she experienced led to a series of accomplishments. In the prints that immediately follow the three that I've shown you, she propagates devotion to the scapular, follows Christ's command to reform Carmel, and travels at night to found one of her convents, assisted by angels. Visually, then, the story links ecstasy with action. This narrative is very much in the spirit of Teresa. Her mystical experiences and her efforts undertaken on behalf of Christ were two sides of the same coin. She warned her nuns that spiritual progress does not consist in resting idly in the enjoyment of God's favors. Quote, "This is the reason for prayer, my daughters, the purpose of the spiritual marriage, the birth always of good works, good works." In her meditation on the Song of Songs, Teresa comments on one of her favorite gospel passages, the episode in John when Jesus speaks of the living water to the Samaritan woman at the well. Like Teresa herself, the Samaritan woman leaves that conversation motivated to work for the profit of the people of her village by spreading news of the Messiah. Teresa says, "So I say that much good is done by those who, after speaking with His Majesty for several years, when receiving His delights, want to serve in laborious ways, even though these delights and consolations are thereby hindered." Van Westervelt's visual narrative then reflects and highlights an essential tenet of Teresa's spirituality. The writings of her co-reformer, John of the Cross, who we see here are one of Van Westervelt's prints. And this is Teresa arriving at John's first convent at Duruella. Let's see if I can focus this a little bit better. And Duruella, I believe, is one of the stops on your Spain tour next fall, right? writings of her co-reformer John the Cross further underscored the linking of divine favors and charitable action. He connects Teresa's transverberation with her leadership role as founder. His treatise, The Living Flame of Love, written in the 1580s, was a commentary on his own poem that begins with the lines, "O living flame of love that tenderly wounds my soul in its deepest center." The image of the flame of love that wounds the soul is John's adaptation of the flame-tipped arrow that pierced Teresa's heart. In an obvious reference to Teresa, he states, quote, "It will happen that while the soul is inflamed with love of God, it will feel that a seraphim is assailing it by means of an arrow or dart, which is all afire with love. Few persons have reached these heights. Some have, however, especially those whose virtue and spirit was to be diffused among their children. For God accords to founders, with respect to the first fruits of the Spirit, wealth and value commensurate with the greater or lesser following they will have in their doctrine and spirituality." John implicitly situates the transverberation as a prelude to Teresa's role as founder and teacher. Since she was a spiritual mother whose virtue and spirit were to be diffused among her children, God stored up wealth in her spirit as exemplified by divine gifts such as the transverberation, for the benefit of the community she had founded. Seeing the transverberation amidst Van Westerhelt's other scenes of Teresa as spiritual mother, founder, teacher, and tireless traveler solidifies this connection for viewers. Van Westerhelt's series indicates that Bernini's sculpture had become so identified with the transverberation that it was a stand-in for the event. No other depiction of Teresa's vision would have the same degree of impact. The statue continued to be reproduced widely and formed the basis for later works of art, as we will now see. The triumphant sculptor. While Van Westerhelt reproduced Bernini's carving as part of his narrative arc of Teresa's life, other artists used it as a source for depictions of very different subjects. Though scholars have not addressed this idea, I believe that a 19th century American work carved in marble is a descendant of Bernini's masterpiece, and that it also carries implications of female empowerment. This is Edmonia Lewis's Death of Cleopatra in the collection of Smithsonian American Art Museum here in D.C. Lewis was the first African-American sculptor to receive national and international acclaim. Her success was remarkable, not only because she overcame racial barriers that typically impeded African-American artists' rise to success, but also because, as a woman, she faced greater obstacles in becoming a recognized artist during the 19th century than did men who had easier access to training and patronage. Since Lewis remains little known, despite increasing scholarly attention, let me first give some biographical details that form context for the piece we see on the left. Lewis was born around 1842 in upstate New York of African-American and Native American parentage. She attended Oberlin College, one of the first institutions of higher learning in the United States to admit women and people of color. With the help of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, she moved to Boston in 1863 and trained in the studio of the neoclassicist sculptor. Sale of her early works, which often depicted abolitionists and Civil War heroes, funded her relocation to Rome in 1866, where she joined a group of female American sculptors who studied ancient Greek and Roman works and looked for skilled carvers who could teach them how to improve their techniques. Her studio in Rome became a favorite destination for wealthy Americans and art critics on the Grand Tour. Her output, much of it now lost, included subjects ranging from Native American themes to women from the Bible. She created several works that explicitly or through allegory dealt with the struggles of African Americans against slavery. These include Forever Free, now in the collection of Howard University's museum. This statue is a tribute to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. It shows a couple released from bondage, the male figure with broken shackles and a female figure kneeling with clasped hands, both of them looking toward heaven in gratitude. One of her religious works depicts Hagar, the slave woman in the book of Genesis who bore a child to Abraham and was then cast into the wilderness with her son Ishmael. Exiled and helpless, she depended on God's intervention for her and her son's survival. Given its theme of faith amidst struggle in the aftermath of slavery, Hagar's story resonated deeply with African Americans during the period of Reconstruction. During her Rome years, Louis also made copies of famed work by earlier artists. So here, for example, is her version of Michelangelo's Moses that she would have seen in a church in Rome. A convert to Catholicism, she must have also visited the Coronary Chapel to see Bernini's celebrated work during her investigations of master sculptors of earlier periods. For the Women's Pavilion of the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, Louis created the image of the Death of Cleopatra, her last known major work. She did extensive research into ancient history, including looking at coins that depicted Cleopatra. According to tradition, this last Egyptian pharaoh committed suicide after her army was defeated by Octavian's forces at the Battle of Actium. In order to avoid being captured by the Roman army and paraded in a triumphal procession, she arranged to have a poisonous snake brought to her in a basket of figs and perished from its bite. Egyptian subjects had a special meaning for Louis and other African-American artists during the 19th century. Egypt meant Africa, and more important, the golden age of the African past, in the same way that ancient Greece and Rome were the classical past for white intellectuals and cultural leaders. Louis identified with her subject, saying, "I have a strong sympathy for all women who have struggled and suffered." Here Cleopatra sits on her throne, wearing her royal headdress and sandals. She has stoically pulled her gown from one shoulder to allow the snake to bite her breast. Gripping the snake in one hand, she remains noble and majestic, in control of her death. As she set out to make the statue, Louis must have looked for models in her predecessor's work. She would have seen earlier images, such as Guido Reni's 17th century painting that shows Cleopatra holding the asp with one breast exposed. I believe that she also studied Bernini's statue while developing her depiction of a woman whose death was both triumph and spectacle. Echoes of Bernini's piece are evident in the details: the position of the head turned toward the left shoulder and falling backward, the dangling left arm, the diagonal form by Cleopatra's body as she slumps down in her throne, and above all, the expression on her face, with closed eyes that express satisfaction and release. Like Bernini's, it is an image of piercing. The instrument of penetration is the snake rather than the arrow. Louis might have also perceived that Bernini's statue, housed in a funerary chapel, alludes to the notion of death through ecstasy. Let me comment briefly on the underpinnings of that idea in the history of devotion to Teresa, since I believe it is relevant for our viewing of Louis's piece. Teresa often compared ecstasy with death. In the midst of certain mystical experiences, she declared, the force of God's love almost sundered her soul from her body, bringing her to the brink of demise. She calls the experience of union with God during prayer a delectable death, and advises her discalced Carmelite nuns, "Do not think, my daughters, that it's an exaggeration when I speak of dying in ecstasy, because it really does happen." Given these statements, it's not surprising that the saint's nuns and early biographers, including those consulted by Bernini, considered her physical death in 1582 to have been the result of a fatal ecstasy, so forceful that it thrust her soul out of her body. Though the physicians attending her attributed to Teresa's demise to loss of blood, Diego de Yepes, writing in his widely circulated 1599 biography of the saint, had a different diagnosis. Quote, "It would certainly be impossible to deny that these ailments greatly contributed towards severing the thread of her life, but the knife that finally killed her was the great force of God's mighty and powerful love, which wrested not only her spirit from her soul, but also her soul from her body." Teresa's companions concurred with this assessment, affirming that the peaceful expression on her face when she died was the same one she often had while in ecstasy. Early 17th century engravings produced in the Spanish Netherlands were among the first works of art to present the transverbration as an evocation of saintly death. A print by Anton Vierix, for example, shows Teresa kneeling on a flower-strewn floor that juts out toward the viewer like a stage. She spreads her arms in surrender as an angel plunges a fiery arrow into her heart. God the Father surveys the scene from above as angels shower blossoms upon the wounded saint. At the bottom of the print is an inscription from the Song of Songs that identifies the scene as a fatal ecstasy. Sustain me with flowers and surround me with apples, for I am dying of love. The linking of the transverbration with death implicit in Bernini's statue survives in Lewis's. Her perception of Bernini's piece as a sort of death of Teresa, therefore, must have triggered associations with the death of Cleopatra. The figure of Cleopatra, as mediated by works of art and literature, such as Rainey's painting and Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, is an ambiguous one. For some audiences, particularly men during the early modern period, Cleopatra's death was emblematic of female sensuality and of retribution for misplaced power that should never have been entrusted to a woman. Others, though, including Lewis herself, understood that her suicide was a moment of triumph. Cleopatra had staged her death in order to prevent her capture and enslavement. Outfitted in royal regalia and sitting on her throne, Cleopatra has performed a dignified suicide in order to resist violent subjugation. Through this piece, Lewis declares the emancipation of Cleopatra from Roman control and, if read allegorically like her figure of Hagar, of African Americans from slavery. She appropriated Bernini's work and refashioned it in order to express her own values and those of the abolitionists who had supported her career. Teresa's wounding, long associated in viewers and readers' minds with death, is here transferred to a context far removed from 16th century Spain. Lewis shows a black woman's ecstatic death, a release from confines that others sought to impose upon her. Yet her triumph, of course, comes at an enormous cost. The image is both tragic and transcendent. The Hillbilly Thomist. I will now turn to two American authors, both of whom created pieces that echo Teresa's transverbation. The first is Flannery O'Connor. O'Connor was born to an Irish-American Catholic family in Savannah, Georgia in 1925. She attended Georgia State College for Women and the graduate writing program at the University of Iowa. Diagnosed with lupus when she was 26, O'Connor returned to Milledgeville and lived with her mother in Regina, where she remained until her death in 1964 at the age of 39. She raised peacocks and she wrote, publishing 2 novels, 31 short stories, and numerous essays and reviews. Far from being a recluse, despite her confinement, she welcomed into her home authors and enthusiasts of her work and correspondents with whom she struck up a friendship. She attended 7 a.m. Mass regularly with her mother at Sacred Heart Church in Milledgeville and was a voracious reader of Catholic literature, from Thomas Aquinas to Thomas Merton. She referred to herself as a hillbilly Thomist. O'Connor read Teresa's writings and recommended the interior castle in a 1956 letter to one of her frequent correspondents, Betty Hester. She also enjoyed a book entitled 3 Mystics that she had received in 1956 as a Christmas gift from her friend William Sessions. This 1949 publication, edited by the discalced Carmelite friar Bruno de Jesus Maria, focuses on Teresa, John of the Cross, and El Greco. There is a section devoted to Teresa's transverbation. I'm assuming O'Connor knew Bernini's statue since she traveled to Rome in 1958 and was such an avid reader of Catholic books and periodicals. And the next step in the research would be to look for illustrations of the sculpture in what we know she read, such as the journal Common Book. For now, it's enticing to think that the drama and sheer physicality, even violence of the statue, in addition to Teresa's own words, inspired one of her best stories, Greenleaf. O'Connor's recurring theme, as she put it in one of her essays, was the action of grace in territory largely held by the devil. Grace crashes into her characters' lives with violence, shattering the complacency and self-satisfaction in which they had been suspended. A recurring motif is that of an intruder whose disruptive presence is shocking, sometimes fatal. Yet it is amid such upheaval that spiritual revelation occurs, so that the intruder, though often depraved, acts as God's instrument. In her best-known story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, a serial killer named the Misfit slaughters a Southern family traveling on the back roads of Georgia. Just before being shot, the grandmother, a comic figure up to that point who communicates in platitudes, suddenly recognizes her own spiritual kinship with the murderer and reaches out to him with a gesture of love. The story Good Country People is about an embittered young woman named Olga, who as a child had lost one leg in a hunting accident. She is an intellectual with a PhD and is an atheist who boastfully professes a belief in nothing. A visiting Bible salesman seduces her and steals her wooden leg, leaving Olga literally without a leg to stand on at the upper level of the barn, where she looks out across the fields and sees him walking on water, a Christ-like intruder who has demolished the self-satisfaction and nihilism upon which she had built her personality. In Greenleaf, the intruder is a stray scrubwool. In a single devastating moment, he brings grace down on the story's central character, Mrs. May, who up to that point had seen no need for God's assistance. She is a prideful, self-pitying widow who points to her skillful running of her dairy farm as evidence of heroic virtue. Quote, before any kind of judgment seat, she would be able to say, I have worked, I have not wallowed. With her own high self-esteem, she is frustrated by the ineptitude of those around her. 2 sons who take no interest in the farm, and a shiftless and elusive tenant farmer, Mr. Greenleaf, who exasperates her endlessly. But she especially disdains Mrs. Greenleaf, whose slovenly household and intense religiosity make her a foil to the fastidious and skeptical Mrs. May. It was an embarrassment in Mrs. May's assessment that instead of maintaining a garden or washing her children's clothes, Mrs. Greenleaf occupied herself with prayer rituals in the woods. One morning, Mrs. May was walking to inspect one of her fields, and she came across Mrs. Greenleaf sprawled on the ground and crying out, Jesus, stab me in the heart. Jesus, stab me in the heart. Mrs. May's mental response gives us a portrait in miniature of her spiritual life. Quote, she thought the word Jesus should be kept inside the church building, like other words inside the bedroom. She was a good Christian woman with a large respect for religion, though she did not, of course, believe any of it was true. Yet it is Mrs. May who, at the story's end, is stabbed in the heart, Teresa-like, and who in that moment of devastation experiences revelation. The story deals with the chaos caused by the escaped bull and Mrs. May's attempt over a period of days to have him pinned up before he breeds her cows, thus ruining the herd. The bull brings disorder to the place that she works so hard to control, and therefore disrupts her own interior security. In the opening scene, Mrs. May hears the bull outside her bedroom window in the middle of the night. Mrs. May's bedroom window was low and faced on the east, and the bull, silvered in the moonlight, stood under it, his head raised as if he listened, like some patient god come down to woo her, for a stir inside the room. Clouds crossing the moon blackened him, and in the dark he began again to tear at the hedge. Presently they passed, and he appeared again in the same spot, chewing steadily, with a hedge reef that he had ripped loose for himself, caught in the tips of his horns. The scene has resonances of the mythological story of Jupiter's descent in the form of a bull, inflamed with love for Europa, so that he can seduce and abduct her as in Titian's in the 16th century painting. Already, though, Mrs. May's visitor is not just Jupiter, but is also a Christ symbol, the hedge reef calling to mind his crown of thorns. A few paragraphs later, quote, the bull lowered his head and shook it, and the wreath slipped down to the base of his horns, where it looked like a menacing prickly crown. O'Connell with her self-portrait of Peacock. Over the course of 2 days, Mrs. May tries to motivate Mr. Greenleaf without success to retrieve the bull and put him back in his pen. Mrs. May is both comic and sympathetic, ridiculous in her outrage, but touching in her increasing fragility as the bull turns her world upside down. She reaches a breaking point after seeing the bull yet again through her bedroom window, despite her repeated instructions for his removal, and orders Mr. Greenleaf to immediately get his gun and shoot the animal. Having driven Mr. Greenleaf to a pasture in order to hunt down and kill the bull, she gets out of the car and leans against its front grille, starting to doze while realizing how exhausted she is from her years of work running the farm and trying to manage those who thwart her intentions. She reaches through the window to honk the horn a few times to let Mr. Greenleaf know that she is getting impatient. Then she sees a black, heavy shadow emerge from the woods and recognizes it as the bull. Quote, he was crossing the pasture toward her at a slow gallop, a gay, almost rocking gait, as if he were overjoyed to find her again. The bull races toward her, Mr. Greenleaf pursuing the animal with his gun, and O'Connor's prose turns transcendent. She stared at the violent black streak, bounding toward her as if she had no sense of distance, as if she could not decide at once what his intention was. And the bull had buried his head in her lap, like a wild, tormented lover, before her expression changed. One of his horns sank until it pierced her heart, and the other curved around her side and held her in an unbreakable grip. She continued to stare straight ahead, but the entire scene in front of her had changed. The tree line was a dark wound in a world that was nothing but sky. And she had the look of a person whose sight has been suddenly restored, but who finds the light of the world. Mrs. May, previously shrouded by self-reliance, now sees her own iniquity and looks out upon her true country, the realm of God. Mr. Greenleaf shoots the bull 4 times through the eye, but in the last sentence we see the transformed Mrs. May and the bull united in an ecstatic embrace. She did not hear the shots, but she felt the quake in the huge body as it sank, pulling her forward on its head, so that she seemed, when Mr. Greenleaf reached her, to be bent over, whispering some last discovery into the evening's ear. Ravished and awakened, she whispers her revelations to the bull, the wild tormented lover who had come down to meet her. In Bernini's statue, heaven intrudes upon earth through the figure of the angel with his arrow that plunges into Teresa's heart. In O'Connor's story, the bull's horn reaches into the recesses of Mrs. May's calcified heart so that grace floods her. Without asking for it, she has received what others have prayed for. One thinks of St. Teresa of Lisieux's act of oblation to merciful love, in which she beseeches God, I offer myself as a victim of Holocaust to your merciful love, and asking you to consume me incessantly, allowing the waves of infinite tenderness shut up within you to overflow into my soul, and that thus I may become a martyr of your love and my God. Or Blessed Elizabeth of the Trinity, in her prayer to the Holy Trinity, O my three, my all, my beatitude, infinite solitude, immensity in which I lose myself, I surrender myself to you as your prey. Bury yourself in me, that I may bury myself in you, until I depart to contemplate in your light the abyss of your greatness. Mrs. May could not have asked for Jesus to stab her in the heart, but he pursues her anyway and makes her his prey. For the next section, I have a handout for you, which is a poem. And Marcia and Charles, could you all just go to the row? The disciplined poet. One of our most astute readers of Teresa is the American poet Richard Gilbert, now 93 years old and still teaching at Amherst College. He twice won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry and has served as United States Poet Laureate. He published his most recent collection in 2010. Included in his 1976 collection, The Mind Reader, is a 3-stanza poem entitled Teresa. As I'll explain in just a moment, the poet has affirmed that he had Bernini's statue in mind when he wrote it, when he first viewed that statue decades ago in the 1950s. The first stanza takes place in the immediate aftermath of the Transfiguration, which leaves Teresa in a state of agitation regarding his origins. After the bright sun's eclipse, the brighter angel and the spirit which drew a bridal outcry from her lips. She could not prove it true, nor think at first of any means to test by what she had been wedded or possessed. As the speaker says, the challenge for Teresa was to demonstrate for herself and for religious authorities around her that the experience was of divine origin. With her bridal outcry, had she been wedded in a mystical marriage to Christ, or possessed, assaulted by a demonic apparition in the guise of an angel? She searches for a means to test the validity of her mystical experience. The anxiety mounts in the second stanza with the introduction of a scenario of seduction and entrapment drawn from Homer's Odyssey. Not all cries were the same. There was an island in mythology called by the very vowels of her name, where vagrants of the sea, changed by a wand, were made to squeal and cry as heavy captives in witches' stuff. We have been transported to Circe's island, Aea, where Odysseus encountered the enchantress who transformed his shipmates into squealing swine. The stanza begins with, "Not all cries were the same," which introduces the notion that vocal outbursts can run the gamut from holy to perverse. At this tense point in the poem, Teresa's experience has not yet been proved authentic to the reader or to herself. There arises the nagging possibility that her own encounter with the supernatural might somehow be analogous to Homer's scenario of an island where disorder, enchantment, and disfiguration prevail. Disquieting correspondences between Teresa and the visitors to Aea begin to emerge. Her cry during ecstasy at the hands of the spear-wielding angel is the counterpart to the sailors' cries after they fell victim to Circe's wand and were turned into swine. Thus arises again the idea of demonic possession. Teresa's supposed angel, like Circe, might be a malevolent creature in the eyes of heaven. And there is another level of dangerous similitude, the association of Teresa with the island. The vowels in her name, E-A, comprise the word Aea. This correlation makes her potentially another Circe, deceptive and dangerous. She herself could be construed as an enchantress who wielded unruly power over men, a concern that was repeatedly voiced during Teresa's lifetime by some of her critics, who complained that a mujercilla, or little woman, was engaging in theological discourse and directing male members of the religious orders. This stanza then suggests the anxieties that surrounded Teresa's project. Was she demonically seduced? Was she herself a seductress who co-opted the authority that should only be wielded by men, and who turned her male followers, such as John of the Cross, into emasculated captives, like the swine in Homer's story? The final stanza, to the readers and Teresa's relief, reveals the fiction of his fears, and all is well. The proof came soon and plain. Visions were true, which quickened her to run God's barefoot errands in the rocks of Spain, beneath its beating sun, and lock the O of ecstasy within the tempered consonants of discipline. The wounding in the first stanza results in hard work in the third. Teresa doesn't languish in ecstasy, but instead navigates the harsh terrain of Castile and Andalusia, carrying out God's commands as founder and teacher. Wilbur's poem is like an altarpiece, a diptych with a rejected third panel. The left panel, the first stanza, is the transverberation, with its eclipsed sun, bright angel, and spear. The poet first tries joining the second stanza, the Circe panel, to the first. Its mention of a wand that casts a spell visually connects Circe to the angel with his spear. But, as Wilbur then shows us, this panel is unfitting, since the angel is in truth the antithesis rather than the twin of Circe. In the third stanza, the poet makes just the right panel to hinge to the first. The beating sun associates it with the sun in the first panel that is eclipsed by the glowing angel. The stabbing and the cry then are the prelude to Teresa's barefoot, discalced errand on God's behalf in the Spanish landscape. Like John of the Cross in his treatise, The Living Flame of Love, and Arnold van Westerhout in his engravings, Wilbur presents us with a story in which mystical experience and active service to God are inseparable. After Wilbur gave a reading at the Folger Library in D.C. in 2010, I told him how much I've enjoyed this poem. I asked whether he had in mind Bernini's statue when he wrote it. He said, "Certainly. I saw it in the church at Santa Maria del Whatever." I said, I love that you convey that Teresa couldn't afford to languish in ecstasy, but that she had to get up and work, traveling around Spain to found convents. He responded, exactly. That is the proper consonance of ecstasy. The word he used is consonance, C-O-N-S-O-N-A-N-C-E, meaning agreement or compatibility. But given Wilbur's wit and love for wordplay, I took his statement to also be a reference to the consonant letters that are mentioned in the last line of the poem. Teresa's bridal outcry takes the form of a vowel, the O of ecstasy, that has to be contained within the consonant letters of discipline, just as the A and E of her own name are held in place by T, R, and S. Discipline tempers the exuberance of her mystical experiences. The same notion can be applied to Wilbur as poet. Recognized for his use of strict poetic form, he envelops the twists and turns of his imagination within disciplined structure, such as the arrangement here of 3 stanzas with 6 lines that each rhyme A, B, C, C. And also notice the form of each stanza, where the first line is indent, the second and third line are both flush, next line is indent, flush, flush. And that stanza form he got from the poems of 17th century British poet George Herbert. Wilbur and Teresa both found a disciplined form befitting their moments of heightened poetic or spiritual experience. Let me close with 2 thoughts. First, this has been a paper of admiration for 4 remarkable creators, in addition to Bernini himself. Though inspired by Bernini, none of these figures is a copyist. As art critic Jed Pearl has put it, all art is in some sense a reenactment. That is one definition of tradition. But the reenactment must involve a discovery or a disclosure of what is most personal in the process of reenactment. That is what makes the old. Arnold van Westerhout, Ammonia Lewis, Flannery O'Connor, and Richard Wilbur all reenacted Bernini's statue. Each, though, did it in an imaginative way, making it new. Second, these 4 figures provide us with productive ways of looking back not only to examples of art and literature, but also to Teresa herself, as she was mediated through Bernini's statue and its successors. Van Westerhout and Wilbur give us the Teresa whose nearness to Christ fueled her work of remarkable activity and accomplishment as monastic reformer. Through Lewis, we see the heroic Teresa who resisted the confines of a male-dominated society and who underwent a love death. In O'Connor, she is the Teresa courted, pursued, and assailed by divine love. Like each of these creators, we too can select from works of art and from Teresa's life what is meaningful for us. And though we might not be engravers, sculptors, short story authors, or poets, use it as a material for our most important creation, that of an interior life. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Christopher for a really phenomenal talk. Myself, in my years in Rome, often stood in front of that statue of St. Teresa and wished I could see it from different perspectives, to see it from above or perhaps from behind, or even to see it at eye level, since it's rather far up there. And I think in many ways you showed us that today. But more important, I think you showed us the way that people have been able to view Teresa from rather unusual, maybe even in some ways unorthodox perspectives. Again, as a social historian, I've always looked at Teresa within that certain box, and to see today the impact that she's had on feminism, on racism, in the literature, I mean, it's really been very interesting to see it from that perspective. So I'd like, if Christopher wants to take 10 or 15 minutes of questions, I'll let you moderate what questions you want to answer.
Yes.
I have a question about Ammonia Lewis. You showed how the Toyota presentation was inspired by this statue, by looking at the similarities.
Yes.
I'm a scientist, so my question is, do you have any hard evidence that he was inspired by it? either by Sandis or by records or whatever, or is it due interpretation? That's my question.
It's interpretation, and by knowing her location, that she herself, she converted to Catholicism, she was living in Rome. We know that she went around making these marble copies of famous statues, which she sold to support herself. Most of those are now lost. So because of those habits, I'm assuming she sold the these, but I don't know as well that's an amazing statue, and part of what's so interesting about that piece is its history. And I think it tells you something about how African American art has been marginalized in our art historical canon. But that statue, after it went to the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876, never made it back to Rome. And we think it might be that because the wisdom of Florida had transported back. And somehow, documentation shows that it ended up in Chicago in a saloon. And then it is next sighted outside. And it was placed in some kind of, it was a field that had been used as a racehorse's grave. And the horse was Cleopatra, and so they used that as her tombstone. And then somehow people forgot that association, and it was placed in a junkyard until Boy Scouts discovered it in the 1970s. And they tried to do their own renovation, which entailed covering it with gold paint. And then finally, some scholar recognized what it was, and the Smithsonian Art Museum bought it, and they put it through extensive conservation. But that statue will never be the same as it was, because we know that, like Lewis's other statues, that the surface was very highly polished, reflective white marble. But because of all the years outside, the marble has become pitted and has lost some of its sheen. But still, it's a remarkable piece. I think it's the best statue in the collection. It's life size. We'll have to go see someone with it. Yes?
Can you comment about this protrusion on her forehead? Is that part of the headgear?
Yes, so she was looking at ancient Egyptian coins and looking at the royal headdress with the cobra symbol that symbolizes Upper Egypt on the headdresses. So she's copying what pharaohs were. Same with the symbols. They did a lot of work.
Could you repeat the comment?
Yes. How did I find all that information about the statue? The Smithsonian American Art Archives are really good. And so they put together the whole story as best as they could piece it together. They did exclusive documentation of the restoration. So the American Art Museum has this statue. They have a statue by Lewis that she did of Hiawatha. And then they have a statue of Agar Becher. And then Howard University has the and after that, it becomes pretty thin. We know from documentation that there was hundreds of works that we don't even know if they exist or not. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks very much. It was a wonderful presentation. And Pneumonia Lewis, I knew nothing about, so that's fascinating. I'm going to go look up and see what there is. I don't know how much there is about her. The other Bernini death related, not the same dying here, the Blessed Movie. Can you make any comments about any relation? I mean, obviously two different scenes, but death related, and since some of the interpretations you talk about by other artists go into death,
Absolutely, yes. So in that piece, she is more recumbent than Teresa, but very similar to those with the head falling back, the closed eyes, and the emphasis on the physicality of them. So I think there must have been some exchange between all those ideas of Teresa's state of ecstasy and that statue. And I think that became, especially after Teresa kind of stopped when she was describing ecstasy in the early period. Yeah, very good connection. Well, thank you all for coming out. It's a beautiful fall day, and there must have been lots of enticement to do other things besides sit in the dark room and listen. So thank you.
I was given some prepared remarks to read, so again, we'd like to thank you all for coming. And the Carmelite Institute of North America cannot exist without your participation and support. So they've refreshed the refreshments in the lobby. So please help yourself to some more. Stay around for a while. Speak to Dr. Wilson personally if you have that opportunity. There's an opportunity too to make a free will offering. This lecture was free, but we're always willing to accept donations. You can even remember us in your will if you want to. So this lady did, which makes this all possible today. And I do want to point out we do have some brochures. We have a number of events coming up that you might be interested in. Next June, the end of June, is the symposium, the 2015 symposium. We have a symposium about every 3 years. And it will be at St. Mary of the Lake College University in Mundelein, Illinois. And we have some wonderful speakers coming to that, including Dr. Donna Orsuto from the Gregorian in Rome. And Dr. Orsuto is a very distinguished Catholic scholar in spirituality. We also have Keith Egan and Brian McDermott and Sister Connie Fitzgerald and some of the usual characters, the usual suspects will be there. So we'd really like to encourage you. I think this would be a really great program. We also, for those interested in more depth experience of St. Teresa, we have a traveling seminar, a traveling symposium next October to November, 29th of October to November 12th, 2015, on a trip through Spain. It's almost 2 weeks, and it will be accompanied by Father Daniel Chowning and Father Stephen Payne, both Discalced Carmelites who are real authorities on St. Teresa, and myself, who has kissed the Blarney Stone, and that's my only credit for public speaking. I do history of the order as well. So I think it'll be a really good program, and so the brochures are there for that. And we'd encourage you to know this. Look at our website, carmelstream.org. Pay some good attention to that website. There's a lot of the activities going on in the Carmelite world, and especially this year for the centenary of St. Teresa of Avila. And finally, before we go, I'd like to thank the Executive Director of the Institute, Mrs. Joan Knedeman, who really put this together today and did a phenomenal job. And unfortunately, Joan is going to be leaving the Institute at the end of this month. And I hope we can get somebody who does as good a job in putting these programs together. It's been a joy to work with Joan. So thank you, Joan, very much for your work, and thank you for organizing today.